it would be really helpful just to do a very quick overview of what autism is. There are lots of sort of myths and misunderstandings, many of which are very limiting for individuals who are on the autistic spectrum. And so it's kind of worth just doing a really quick view of what autism is in real terms. So a common feature of autistic spectrum conditions, and it's quite useful to point out that the sort of better way of describing it is autistic spectrum conditions rather than autistic spectrum disorders. We much prefer that, as it is not necessarily a disorder for people. There are many challenges with sort of social and communication. Individuals may find it hard to interpret both verbal and non-verbal language, so things like tone of voice, sarcasm, humour, etc. are particularly difficult to interpret. And that's important when you're interacting with somebody with ASC, because essentially you may think you're being really funny or amusing, but it may be completely lost on them and particularly confusing for them. Some individuals may be non-verbal, but actually many have very good verbal skills, and many use language that's highly complex or may seem overly formal. And that creates an issue when you're communicating, because it may be somebody who has quite profound challenges in some areas, but they're not sort of easily recognizable in their verbal communications. Common features are things like taking things literally and not understanding some of the abstract concepts in language, needing additional time to process information or answer questions, and in some cases repeating what other individuals say to them. This can mean that their communications can often be misinterpreted, or they may not be adequately able to express how they're feeling, particularly when in stressful or unfamiliar situations. And that's particularly important when an individual is expressing when they're experiencing mental health challenges, or in fact when they're experiencing great levels of distress. They may not be able to articulate those feelings in a way that other people can understand. So sometimes their distress gets overlooked or misunderstood. Social interaction could be problematic. Individuals quite often have difficulty reading other people and recognizing and understanding others' feelings and intentions, or indeed expressing their own emotions. So it makes it very hard to navigate the social world. In some ways, what this also means is that they're can be very vulnerable in social situations. So we see a lot of people potentially making inappropriate or dangerous friendships, for example. Individuals can appear to be insensitive. They can seek out to be alone, particularly when they're overloaded by other people. They may not seek comfort from other people, which again, within a mental health environment is particularly difficult. In some ways, they might appear to behave strangely, or I would prefer to say unexpectedly, or in a socially inappropriate sort of way. They kind of don't do what we expect on occasion, and that can be very confusing for people who are working and supporting with those individuals. And certainly there can be challenges around forming friendships, and as I say, particularly appropriate friendships. The criminal justice system, for example, has numerous examples of where people have been exploited because of these sorts of vulnerabilities. You sometimes see repetitive behaviours because the world has many unwritten rules, and it can seem a very sort of confusing and place for individuals with ASC. So people tend to prefer to have routines, so they know what's going to happen. So they might prefer to travel to the same way to school or to work. They might like to eat the same breakfast cereal every morning, and that breakfast cereal may need, in fact, to be exactly the same brand in exactly the same bowl with exactly the same spoon. It's a way that individuals can bring order to the chaos that is around them. You might also notice that individuals carry out sort of quite repetitive behaviours, such as twirling a pen or all manner of things. And quite often that's used as a strategy by individuals for sort of calming, and it can be very helpful to kind of use those things within a situation to sort of help people find balance and sort of reset the equilibrium. A change of routine can be incredibly difficult to cope with, and certainly at we've had many of our sort of people that come to us have had massive levels of anxiety around COVID, and particularly because for many individuals they really want to follow the rules. You know, we're talking about many people who are highly intelligent, they follow the news stories, they see what Boris has said and they will follow that to the letter, which, if you think about what a lot of Boris says, for many people that's confusing. So when you're trying to follow that to the letter, you can imagine how difficult that is. So if Boris says stay at home, you stay at home. But then when school says you've got to go to school, that contradicts what Boris just said. So you can see how very quickly individuals get completely overwhelmed with the endless sort of stream of instructions and dictates, but they are rapidly changing. And to try and keep up with those and balance and work out what they are supposed to be doing or not supposed to be doing is immensely challenging and leads to sort of complete overload, and a desire, as I say, to follow the rules. You might find individuals are hyper or hypo sensitive to things. So genuinely, sort of everyday situations can be incredibly uncomfortable or distressing. So things like background music, for example, in a shopping centre or in a restaurant can be awful for somebody who is on the spectrum. They can't really struggle to filter it out, and it can completely overload. Um, and as a consequence, individuals quite often want to remove themselves to those situations, or indeed just avoid going into what we would perceive as normal situations. So, you know, anywhere that is too bright, too loud, too smelly, too crowded can completely lead to this sort of overload. You might also see individuals that have really highly focused interests, and this can start at a fairly young age. It changes over a lifetime, clearly, but many autistic people become experts in their sort of special interests and certainly like to share their knowledge, but they may fail to recognise when sharing your knowledge either isn't appropriate or where the other person has become bored with what you're saying, and that sort of becomes quite problematic. Um, it may also be that because of the sort of highly focused interest in something, that they neglect other areas of their life. So, for example, many of the individuals we work with have issues with things like personal hygiene, managing their lives, managing day-to-day activities, because they're so focused on one area that the rest of it falls to the wayside. So, but consequently, many individuals do incredibly well academically, and if they can get into work, do very well in the workplace because they become highly focused on in those situations. However, there are some massive positives, and these are the things in your video earlier on that, you know, quite often get overlooked. Individuals are passionate, really passionate about the subjects that interest them, and that may not be limited to just one or two subjects. It may be a really broad range of subjects. They're quite likely to have an interest and understanding that is far deeper than many other people, and it's no wonder that many of our great thinkers are on the spectrum. It often means also that individuals are incredibly tenacious and determined. They don't let things go. Where others would give up, people with ASC will follow through on things, and it means they can achieve great success. You know, they don't give up and worry about being uncool. They just passionately pursue what's interested to them. Individuals are incredibly honest. So if you want to know if you're having a bad hair day or if you've put on a few extra pounds, the best person to ask is somebody on the spectrum, because trust me, you'll get a really honest answer. And in today's world of sort of smoke and mirrors, honesty is invaluable, and it can be really refreshing to be working with somebody on the spectrum. Unfortunately, sometimes this directness is perceived by others as being blunt or rude, but the key thing around this is that there is never any intention to hurt somebody's feelings or to bully somebody or to manipulate somebody. It's an absolutely straightforward view. So for me, I think cutting through some of the communications nonsense that we all have to deal with is a massive bonus, to be honest. I think at the very heart of what neurodiversity means, though, is the differences in the way that information is processed. Without these abilities, we would likely never see any new innovations or make big breakthroughs. For some people with ASC, they have a great ability to visualize concepts and ideas, and that leads them to solve problems far faster. But also, there is an immense ability to focus on the detail. Whilst coming up with great ideas is helpful, they're not much use to anybody if you can't actually follow through and really focus on what's going to make those things work. So focusing on the detail is key. They might also notice patterns to information and be able to analyze it really effectively. So this ability to focus is an incredible skill. It also means that for many people who are autistic, which combines with the hyper and hyposensitivity, is that they're able to identify nuances and beauty in things that surround them. They attend well to the detail, not just the task, but what surrounds it as well. So they have the ability to focus really quite broadly on something. And whilst individuals, do enjoy routines, it can mean that they're incredibly effective and efficient at carrying out tasks. So when you combine that with a great attention to detail, there are huge areas of life and work where it's a great combination. Many individuals have really good memory, although, with Rain Man and all the other things that go along with autism, there are many myths and misrepresentations about it. But certainly many individuals do have great memories for facts, and that's particularly the case where it's related to things that interest them. So it's interesting to consider the potential skills and abilities, because what happens is if we rephrase them in negative terms, such as obsessive, rigid, lacking social skills, we actually might still be describing the same things. Language is important because it can help us to value individuals, but it is also used to label individuals and also devalue those same skills and abilities, and then ultimately the individual that possesses them. Ultimately, it depends on from which end of the telescope you're viewing things and the environment in which the individual finds themselves. But one thing is certain, and that is valuing and nurturing skills and abilities is far more likely to lead to success and happiness. Mental health and autism is a massive issue. And looking at the research, and there is numerous amounts of research and data on the subject, Mind identifies that about 70% of autistic individuals experience mental health issues, and that's a massive number. In a survey by Amaze, 42% said that they felt that they were not listened to or taken seriously. 52% said they had negative experiencing when accessing services, and 36% said they felt practitioners had inadequate knowledge of autism. So essentially, we know that it's something that is quite common for autistic spectrum conditions, but actually when individuals want to access services, they don't get taken seriously and they don't get listened to, and they really struggle to access appropriate services, or they're met with people that don't understand what their needs are and how they're able to articulate those needs. Anxiety is probably the most common challenge experienced by people with ASC, and it does have a significant impact on daily living. If you combine the challenges with social interaction and the fear and risk of potential rejection in social situations, it can lead to social isolation and almost a fear of asking for help, limit self-expression, even limiting activities such as going shopping, eating in public, using toilet facilities away from home. Hyper or hypersensitivities can lead to an individual avoiding situations where they may be uncomfortable and may be very anxious that they won't be able to cope. individuals may also worry about the future in the wider world, especially at the moment when the media bombards us with constantly negative and sensationalized stories. And it is a real issue at the moment for many people on the spectrum, that it's just this information overload. The Mind research identified, though, that diagnosis of ASC helps an individual to make sense of things and understand their situation, but it was still massively lacking the support that understood both aspects of ASC and mental health. Mental health issues often start in adolescence, but when these issues go unaddressed, they accumulate across a lifetime, leading them to having a serious impact on the individual. We then see what we would sort of loosely term as really extreme anxiety. And certainly some of the people we work with at IAM, it's not unusual for us to be working with somebody, for example, we've got a person at the moment that hasn't left the house for 12 months. We've got people that haven't left the house since lockdown, because they are just so anxious about the COVID situation, and it's just built on top of existing anxieties. So when this anxiety starts to impact on things like confidence and self-esteem, it then leads to feelings of inadequacy and failure. In turn, this can prevent an individual from moving forward and trying new things, or inhibit even further their ability to cope with change. The problem is that all too often these issues are ignored or brushed aside, or just being seen as a normal part of ASC, and they're not. The anxiety is real and often crippling for the individual, but nobody should have to suffer from it. It shouldn't be normalized. Just because somebody has ASC, it shouldn't be normalized that it's a natural part of that thing. It certainly can cause very real physical symptoms, just as anxiety does, so disturbing sleep, stomach upsets, headaches, and in the worst cases, certainly lead to breakdown, self-harm, and even suicide. And again, something that we see and hear about all the time at IAM is where anxiety that is around social interaction has kind of crossed over to be completely crippling. I've done that, but I thought it would be useful to sort of provide a sort of case study of some of the individuals that we work with. So LB is an autistic young person. She experienced extreme bullying in school because of her ASC, and she's now refusing to go to school. Her parents were told that LB was simply misinterpreting the behaviours and communications of others as a result of being on the spectrum. When we worked with LB, she was encouraged to keep a log of incidents. So one of the issues with things like bullying is that, firstly, quite often individuals are told that they're misinterpreting the communication of others. And because they struggle sometimes to express their emotion, it may almost appear that they are underreacting to what they're describing, or they're unable to describe the incident and then overreacting to what might be seen as trivial. So one of the things that we encourage individuals to do, for example, is to keep a journal, because that's factual. It detaches from the emotions, but it was much easier for LB to express, to log the incidents that were going on. And when that was shared with the school, and trust me, it was a very detailed log, they were able to realise that the bullying was in fact very real and very serious, and it was actually dealt with appropriately. But in this situation, her responses were just written off to misinterpreting the situation and overreacting. And then when she was closely questioned by teaching staff as to what had gone on, she couldn't express it effectively and went into shutdown. So again, it just looked like what she was saying wasn't credible. Certainly when individuals get overwhelmed, it can become lead to sort of outbursts or meltdowns or shutdowns. These are really intense and exhausting experiences for an individual. A meltdown happens when somebody becomes completely overwhelmed by their current situation and they temporarily lose control. It could be verbal, it could be physical, it could be both. quite often meltdowns are misinterpreted as temper tantrums, and certainly parents get a huge amount of blame for these, where children are seen to be acting up or misbehaving. And for parents, it's really tough because you feel like you're being judged on your parenting skills, and people just don't understand. They don't understand what's going on, and they misinterpret it. It certainly isn't poor behavior. A shutdown is quite often less intense, but it can be massively damaging for the individual and debilitating. So shutdowns are a response to just being completely overloaded. It almost is a complete switching off, because the brain can't process the information fast enough to react. As a consequence, again, people think that they've disengaged, that they're not interested, but it can actually be that they're just totally overwhelmed. And both meltdowns and shutdowns are core examples of extreme distress. Again, another case study that I thought was interesting, and this is a really recent one since COVID. So since JA has started back in school, he's had 19 detentions since September, which in and of itself is fairly shocking. Needless to say, his teachers are very cross with him. They're trying to enforce the restrictions being placed on them by COVID, but in this case, JA seems totally oblivious to them. He refuses to eat in the school canteen with his bubble, and regularly leaves his seat and walks out of the classroom. He also regularly bangs his head on the table. Clearly, walking out of the classroom and not eating in the canteen is not allowed, because he's in his bubble in school and he's not allowed to. That freedom of movement is just really restricted. One of our key workers discussed the problem with JA, and he identified very, very clearly that he finds the smell in the classroom totally overwhelmingly unpleasant. And whilst he can cope for short periods, he finds he has to leave the environment to prevent himself from having a meltdown. Likewise, in the canteen, the environment is so noisy and chaotic that he just can't stand to be in there for any time at all, never mind actually eat anything. We were able to explain the situation to the school, and they were able to put in place some reasonable adjustments that enabled him to cope, that conformed with COVID. But this isn't an unusual case. We're hearing from parents and from children frequently that are really not just coping with the changes and the restrictions being placed on them. So they're being forced, square peg into a round hole. And where the support might have been in place previously, it's now not possible to do. So, in this case, JA had previous permission, if he felt overwhelmed, to leave the room and go to find a quiet place to sort of reset. But of course, he can't do that now. So in effect, what he knows will work for him is now being removed. There are lots of myths around ASC. People think individuals don't want or even require social interaction, and this most often couldn't be further from the truth. Equally, most support is focused on the negative aspects of autism without considering the strengths, which can be utilised to develop safe social relationships based on shared interests, goals and aspirations. At IAM, we do a lot of social and leisure activities, and they are actually a core part of what we do. We listen to what our members want and have activities that people want to participate in. The key here is that our activities provide a safe space for individuals to engage in social action without fear of being judged. They also provide an opportunity for peer-to-peer support systems to facilitate the sharing of experiences and strategies that might help. Our key workers are always there and work with the individuals, not just putting them all in a room and hoping they get on with it, but actually to engage and develop social skills and to act as a safety net for individuals if they're not coping or if they need further support. So what do we need to do? There needs to be massive awareness for those working in or referring for mental health services. There needs to be an understanding that the relationship between mental health and autistic spectrum conditions is not necessarily a given, and one should, you know, you have one doesn't mean you're going to have the other. Oh, there's a message. We need to stop seeing mental health as something that is inevitably accompanying ASC, but also fast referral routes and much more support for families and young people. We also see that high functioning autism is really not well identified. Girls are massively missed, and they tend to mask their difficulties, which is hugely mentally exhausting. Where ASC is considered, expert advice does need to be sought, and then targeted and focused support can be highly effective to overcome the challenges. And what we do is develop a person-centered approach with a clear development plan to move people forwards. And this is what we do. So we do one-to-one support, we do outreach support, we offer advice and guidance and support for education and service providers, we do workplace needs assessments, we have a huge raft of social and leisure activities, and I've not got my camera on because it will freak out my broadband, but if you'd see me, I'd be smiling because we were actually working on our activity schedule for next year, and some of the activities are absolutely fantastic. So we'll be hopefully, once COVID is over, we'll be able to do a lot more sort of group activities. But what we have been doing is Zoom chats for individuals, so that we are managing to stay connected to people, and we also do training and consultation. I'm sure we're running out of time. That was incredibly quick. Has anybody got any questions?
If anybody's got any questions for Helen, please feel free. We've not been called back into the main room yet. We usually get about 2 minutes notice, so.
We've had a message to break for lunch.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure whether they're bringing us back into the main auditorium before we break at 12 and come back at 12:30.
No questions?
No questions.
Wow.
Can I just say thank you so much to Helen? That was an amazing presentation. And I must admit, sort of my nephew has ASC, and I cannot wait to share this presentation with both my mum and my sister. I think they'll find it really, really interesting, but neither of them could be here today, but it was a really, really good presentation. So thank you, Helen.
Oh, my pleasure. And if you need any more information, then this is where we are, and we're also on Facebook, clearly. There will be a blog post as well going up on our website about mental health, hopefully today, if not later on this week, which we'll link to on our Facebook page, and that will just sort of basically cover exactly what I've said in the presentation. So yeah, and as I say, if you want any more help, support, information, or you want to direct people to us, you know, more than happy to speak to you.